Asynchronous lecture, comments on internal language and cognitions. Although over the last 50 years, psychotherapy has developed techniques to change internal language called cognitive behavior therapy, rational emotive therapy, and others. There's really nothing new about those concepts. I'm always impressed when I go back in the history of the Chinese philosopher who lived more than 500 years before Christ. And as he stated, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. If you're at peace, you're living in the present. Or in the same way, the Stoic philosophers really had looked at cognitions and how you relate to it. These are then the Greek philosophers who lived around 50 AD to 135 AD, such as Epictetus. As he said, men are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of them. Or, it is not what happens to you, but how you react to that matters. And if you're intrigued in any of these concepts, from a philosophic perspective, there's a great book by Irvine called The Stoic Challenge, a philosopher's guide to becoming tougher, calmer, and more resilient. In that way, language, how we think, is a major issue and seems to be related to a certain extent to our anxieties and to our depression. So this component today, we'll look at some of that. Remember, major depression or depression is one of the leading causes of disability in the United States. And depression, as well as anxiety, has continued to increase as people have been staying at home with COVID. And there are many treatment strategies of these. One is obviously the recognition that one is depressed. And the most common treatment strategies, there really is usually pharmaceuticals. But I want to think about it a little bit more. Remember, depression, to label it as a disorder, as an illness, may not always do justice to it. When people are really depressed, it's disastrous. It's difficult. So I'm not negating how difficult it can be. And sometimes depression is the healthy response for a moment of the body to loss and the person to loss of family members, jobs, change in environment. It's a kind of grieving. And that is a normal feeling low and down. And that really with social support and many other approaches, one slowly goes through this. In our more modern era of pharmaceuticals, we very quickly, when one goes to a healthcare provider, it's labeled as depression and then take pharmaceuticals. But pharmaceuticals don't help really in a true sense if you have just lost your job, if you lost your spouse or a partner or whatever it may be. So it is there, you need to look at those external behaviors as well. But let me think of the treatment strategies to think of this. Obviously, when one is very morbidly depressed, one is totally immobilized, all treatment is necessary. But when is lower, when one feels more depressed, maybe possibly relabel it to yourself. I feel more powerless. I feel like I have no energy. I feel like I can't do anything. Try to reframe it as a kind of change in what you're doing and what can be done for it. From my perspective, there are really two major themes. One would be a structural perspective that would look at depression or anxiety or any of these other issues as structural. That means it is either genetic, it is a low level of certain neurotransmitters or whatever, and implies that only when you add or subtract a neurotransmitter or do something, then the physiology the illness can get better. It's the analogy from physical medicine, like in diabetes, like type 1 diabetes. The pancreas stops working. You no longer produce insulin. Now you must take some version of insulin to be able to deal with the sugars. However, many people who are depressed, it may not be quite that way. Yes, there are probably genetic involvements, there are dietary involvements, there are many other causes. However, it's probably a little more analogous to type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes may imply that you have a predisposition for diabetes because of genetics. And then it depends how you your lifestyle, which is also environmentally related to the foods that are available, to how you were brought up, to life stressors, etc. And if you really change your diet, reducing carbohydrates, for simple carbohydrates, do more exercise, reduce stress, it may be likely that type 2 diabetes is reduced. And those are strategies that I'll call a functional perspective, namely how you're using yourself develops the structure. And so when I think of the holistic perspective of this, then I look at that second component, asking what can we do to optimize our own health, and how can we work with depression or with this lower energy level. Maybe I like that word almost better. I have very low energy. I lack motivation. Notice if I label it more specifically, I am not motivated, then maybe I can ask the question also, what can one do? Now, there are many ways to deal with depression or with many cognitive anxieties. And a classical approach for this, which was developed really in the 1960s, and so have been that of cognitive behavior therapy in all different versions. And there were really two roots of that. One was the work by Albert Ellis. He called it rational emotive therapy, which was developed basically beginning in 1956. And the other is the work by Aaron Beck, which was started in the 1960s. They're different and similar, and this work has continued on in all different versions of looking at it, etc. So I want to first go a little bit about explaining this process, but notice what this process is saying implicitly. It's how you are thinking inside yourself, how you're interpreting yourself, how you interpret the events around you that affects you. So the logic in this sense is that how you're thinking and using your brain changes your own neurotransmitters. And you all know that a little bit. If you start thinking about a past memory which makes you happy, or even an intimacy image, you may feel a sense of arousal inside of you. Notice that changes your physiology. On the other hand, when you reflect and you start thinking of times you felt totally defeated and hurt, then maybe you also sink back in. You notice it does change. And most likely, if we can slowly work at changing the thoughts, at least we are changing a component that may contribute to the maintenance and the development of feeling more hopeless and helpless and depressed. So overall, the underlying themes of cognitive therapy really imply and are based upon the concept that every thought cognition has a somatic expression and vice versa. This, in the field where I work in applied psychophysiology and biofeedback, is called the psychophysiological principle. Every thought, every emotion has a body change, and every change in the body has a change in the cognitions and emotions. And the underlying theme of this, the second part, is that cognitions, thoughts, occur all the time, usually without any cognitive awareness. We just think and do things automatically, no different than when you're used to driving your car. You can sometimes drive from one place to the other and don't even quite know how you got there. These, in the same way, cognitive patterns are highly conditioned and overlearned, and often classically conditioned to specific events. You just see something and automatically the thoughts pop in again. And to change it takes much practice and role rehearsal. Now, let me give it as a personal example, how hard that was. I remember many years ago, I was deeply in love. And then the woman decided to break up with me. I was just devastated. It was on a Friday afternoon. And all of a sudden I was happy before, and then she left. And all of a sudden the world became bleak. I felt sort of hungry. I looked at the food, but it had no taste, nothing. It's just like my energy just dropped. And then the phone would ring and my thought would go, I hope it is her, even though I needed to accept that she had gone, and my world went on. And I looked at a picture, where we had gone. And the moment I looked at the picture, it reminded me of her, and I felt again the loss. I would walk down the streets where I lived in Berkeley, where we would go to a restaurant. I would pass the restaurant. And the same thing happened. I would drive my car and I would see the model of the car again, driving, maybe it's her. And these thoughts were hundreds of the time. I didn't even realize how many there were like this. And for the whole week, I felt really kind of energy low. I felt depressed. I felt the kind of nothing. I did this. This happened for a week. Yeah, you could say I was heartbroken. That's legitimate. And I realized that yes, initially I was angry. How could she leave me? But I have another philosophy that says, well, if I really wish you well. So underneath my loss, I had a belief that if it didn't work out for me, it means that you're not a bad person. I really, truly wish you well on your journey. So that's the underlying theme I have. But anyway, I felt like this miserably for a week. The world felt bleak. It had lost color. Nothing was interesting. When I sat, I wanted to stand up. When I stood, I wanted to sit down. I didn't want to wake up in the morning. I just felt blah. That occurred to the following Friday. And then I realized I needed to change because I had read some of this and I realized it was really my sequence of thoughts that kept evoking this process of loss, this process, I wish you were here, which is not going to happen. When the phone would ring, that thought would pop up. And then when I observed myself very, very carefully, when the phone would ring, almost before it had words, the kind of feeling would rise up inside of me, almost the memory. I just observed this, and it happened without words, literally many thousands of times. And I remember then, by that following Friday, I finally decided, I need to change. I need to change my thoughts. Here, I talk about this, I need to do it. So I said, don't think about it. Don't think about the pink elephant. What color is it again? It didn't seem to work. It just worked automatically. So then I finally had to choose, how can I stop and change that language? Now, the exercise for me was voluntary. I used it out of kind of behavior therapy for stop smoking. I'm not saying anybody else should do that. But remember, I made a voluntary choice to do this. I chose to acknowledge I felt heartbroken, I felt the loss. And I chose to let go of these thoughts, to focus on the future, instead of saying, please be here, please be here. And once I made that decision, then the question was, how can I interrupt the thoughts? And I realized just trying to say, stop thinking, didn't work. So then I remember the technique of smoking, not that I ever smoked, where people would wear a rubber band, and when they felt the urge to smoke, they would pull this rubber band, let it snap against the skin, kind of painful sensation that would interrupt that urge. And it seemed to be successful for some people. So I said, okay, I'll just do that. So it was Friday afternoon, a week later. I made that choice. That's probably very important. I chose to take control, which is different versus saying, the world lets me go for a ride. I chose to control. I put the rubber band on. And then every time the thought just bubbled up, before it even had form, I would snap this rubber band, ouch. It would stop the thought. And then I use that as the cue also to think of a very pleasant, peaceful place of hiking Yosemite Valley. And I could just smile for a moment. And it's no different than the QR experience, experiment of practice 5, where you would you feel the stressor, you take a deep breath and a half smile. And for me, I evoked that image then of Yosemite hiking. And I literally did it to every time that thought bubbled up. It's shocking how many times it bubbled up. The phone would ring, and automatically I could almost feel that sensation occurring inside of me. And before it became a reality, I snapped the rubber band again, let it go. Well, it was so impressive. Within a half an hour, I started to feel undepressed. It didn't mean it was easy. I needed to continue that the next days. I needed to continue, and I drove back to San Francisco State, and I would see a car like hers, and my brain, maybe it's her, but before I ever said it was her, I would already pull the rubber band. I had to use my other wrist because this wrist was too raw. I did this, but it was just remarkable how it changed. I chose to change the language. I am not saying it's easy. I was very lucky because I did not let these paths, these patterns continue for a long time. It was not, and I want to repeat, it was not that I said, you're bad. It wasn't about the person. I wasn't saying, I don't love you. I just accepted my state and chose to move on. Okay, now let me go to the areas of cognitive behavior therapy, which I want to do. Basically, the core strategy, which I illustrate in my part in a different way of cognitive therapy, is the idea is to monitor automatic negative thoughts and cognitions. Recognize the connection between the cognitions, your emotions, and your behavior. For me, remember that example what was the evidence she was going to come back? No, it wasn't. It was my delusion, in a sense, that let me get depressed. And then I felt depressed and I felt I didn't want to do anything. Then examine the evidence for and against your own distorted automatic thoughts. And then substitute more reality-oriented interpretations for these biased cognitions. And finally, learn to identify and alter our beliefs that really predispose ourselves to those thoughts. Okay. And so that is the basic sense. And the early work of cognitive therapy, I'll point out with the work by Aaron Beck, for example, in depression, is that you could argue that at least for some people, I never want to say for everybody, but for a number of people who tend to be depressed, they have a certain thought sequence pattern that may trigger and deepen or make the depression worse. Basically, if you think about it, the person, when they feel more hopeless and depressed, tend to see themselves, that they have a negative view of themselves. I'm deficient. I am not, I'm defective almost. I'm depressed because I had the wrong childhood. I'm depressed because whatever. Notice it's all almost because it's my fault, my defects. And basically at the same time, the person may feel they don't have the skills or the attributes to claim growth or happiness versus saying, the world gave me I had a rotten background and I am willing to change and do something. Then overall, the person automatically interprets their experiences negatively. So basically, with our interactions with the world, I tend to usually interpret as defeat or deprivation. The glass is half full, and I can focus on the glass that's half empty, which is the kind of negative thing. How little is there? Versus saying, gosh, I'm so lucky. This also was a tiny piece almost when we did the exercise where you thought of that memory of wholeness, remember? The memory of wholeness can be interpreted two ways. One, especially if it's a family member you were thinking of, like a grandparent, and they may have died. One, I'm so lucky that I've had that experience with that person. That is a sense of a positive interpretation. Versus that same event, they're not here. I feel the loss. And it's a choice how we interpret that event. Remember, that is really almost what I said earlier. That's what Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, had said. We are not disturbed by the things, but by the views we take of them. And I think that is such a critical piece. And then what is even more disturbing, the person has a negative view of the future. And that's not saying that isn't always realistic. The future can be very bleak at times, but it's like an ongoing negative view. No one is perfect. No one is only an optimist all the time. But overall, yes, even at COVID, I may lose a job. And there could be a lining, a silver lining in the end. And those who can look for that silver lining, look for the options, have more resilience. It's very challenging because all these are also embedded in our culture around us. So in a way, you could say that a part of the kind of cognitive approach for depression, a part even of anxiety, it maybe is that we do faulty information processing. And let me see and give an example. We often may overgeneralize. Think of it when you had roommates or something like that, or in a family, somebody walks in the house, they're sort of upset, and automatically you say, what did I do wrong? Wait a minute, I have no idea what I did wrong, nothing to do with it. The question is, you're upset, what happened for you? Or I'm at the supermarket, the clerk is sort of short with me, and I feel they don't like me. There's no evidence for this. Maybe just had a bad day. They're exhausted. Or when I look at the mirror and I see this little tiny zits or black dot. And for me, that takes my whole focus. This is now as big as Mount Everest. It's just sticking out of my whole face. No one else sees it. But we're so self-concerned. We're saying, okay, it's just that. Or we often will personalize. When someone else is upset, it must be my fault. There are many other ways. So it's really trying to understand how we are processing information and just do that. And just for a humorous way, let me do it as follows. It's really how you look at all of this. And these are the two ways one can look at everything. So this is a kind of humor piece. A man and his wife are dining at a table in a plush restaurant. And the man, the husband, keeps staring at a drunken lady swigging her drink as she sits alone at the nearby table. The wife asks, "Do you know her?" "Yes," sighs the husband. "She's my ex-girlfriend. I understood she took drinking right after we split up 7 years ago. And I heard she hasn't been sober since." A long pause. "My God," says the wife, "who would think a person could go on celebrating that long?" Anyway, it is humor or not. Okay. So really what we're talking about is the language you use. I use the example of depression a bit, but let me go now beyond. Really, what is the internal language we use which may get us stuck? Usually it's when we see something as a trait versus a state. I'm an angry person. That is a trait versus at this moment of time, I'm angry. I'm stupid. No, at this moment of time, I have more difficulty learning. Notice it's a kind of language. It's a language where the vocabulary tends to be where you are powerless. And we've talked about it in class. I have to do it. No, who says you have to? Versus I choose. What other language are you using about that? And it's often many negative self-judgments or critiques. I was just thinking, we're having done some work with people who have had cancer. And I remember a quote once by one of the patients, which said, "Bold is beautiful. God only made so many perfect heads. The others, he, she covered with hair." And imagine if you can say that to yourself, even as the result of chemotherapy, what a difference that may mean. Or I like the other one, a totally different vocabulary by Lec7b, who says, if you rearrange the letters in the word depression, so it's rearranging, getting another view to the world, you get the words, I pressed on. And then remember, your current situation is not your final destination. And I think those are critical concepts to keep in mind. And so finally, the other part I want to talk about is the work by Seligman in terms of how we label ourselves. So think again of the language of empowered versus victim language, or a pessimistic perspective versus an optimistic perspective. It's always the same event. A pessimistic perspective of a negative event basically states the person caused it, they're at fault, and they're permanently defective. It will last forever and affects every part of my life. For example, I do an exam, I don't do well. It's caused by me because I'm not smart. The effect of that, means I will never be smart. I'm always dumb. And it will affect everything in my world because I won't get good jobs, etc. On the other hand, an optimistic perspective, the same negative event, can say, well, you can do it a little bit. I did not take time to study. That already says it can change. Or the instructor just asked questions, miserable questions. Or, yes, I didn't do well on this exam today. Next time I can study more. And this will not affect all my other words. I have many more opportunities, or I can do something different. It's a reframing. And the same way, a pessimistic perspective of a positive event is very useful. It usually implies it was out of my control. You would say, it was luck. In sports, I threw a pitch, it was a perfect one. It was luck that I did it. No, that's a pessimistic perspective. And you would say the positive event only lasts for a short time and And then finally, there's no effect of anything else. The optimistic perspective looks at the same event and sees, yes, that most likely it was more they contributed to their, it was their skills. This luck will last, this event will last for, or the impact will last for a long time and will probably affect many other things. It's a slightly different perspective. And then Marty Seligman, then at University of Pennsylvania, put this work together, and he would frame this in a certain way that you could define the language as stable versus unstable. The language, when something is negative event, is that stable or unstable? You want it to be unstable. Is it global or Pacific? You want it to be specific if it's negative, global if it's positive. Is it internal or external? If it's negative, you want it to be external. If it's positive, it's internal. You're the cause of the positive things. And it's sometimes very useful to take an event and just for a moment sit back, write a negative event that happened to you. Write because, and see how you describe it. Were you late for a meeting? It can be as simple as that. What were the reasons? You know, was it did you describe it as your fault, thereby it affected everything? But write something like this, or big ones. Write it out, and then think about it in terms of the language you use. How did you describe it? Did you write it in a more pessimistic perspective or an optimistic perspective? You know, what is so interesting about this kind of exercise is that it makes major impacts, or not the exercise. What's so interesting about this concept by Seligman, that it can even predict longevity, believe it or not. So when people look at these attributions, how people speak about positive or negative events, you can categorize people being more optimistic or pessimistic. And there's been a really interesting study he did with baseball players from the Hall of Fame. So he took all the baseball players who had died. Then he had his students extract all the newspaper stories by sports writers. Notice that's not even the baseball players themselves, just by the sports writers. And then you take away all the identification labels. You identify the events. Let's say the person, you know, hit a home run. How did the sports writer describe the person? Did they mainly say that the person implied this was luck, or this was the result of my training? I'm always good hitting home runs. Notice you can now rate this, and he did. And then what you can see is when you go to the Hall of Fame, and you look at all those baseball players who have died, that the ones who are most pessimistic, the ones who then tend to interpret the world negatively in that sense, are the ones who died much earlier than those who interpret it positively. It's also a predictor, this sense of attribution to events, how you will perform in school in terms of if you get a poor grade, will you feel more depressed at the end of the semester or not? And if you have a positive attribution in that sense, and you say, well, it happened just at this moment, then I can go on, it gives you the energy to continue. Anyway, I think I'll stop on this part for that. I have one more piece to go to, but I thought I interrupted with a poem. But before doing that, just get up for an instant. Just get up, wiggle, move, whatever you see my head moves, just wiggle, reach up, really extend, take a very big breath. Ah, how great. Aren't we so lucky we have the opportunity to stand and do it, that we have the moment we can do that. And now sit back and just feel that for that moment, you have a moment increase in energy. Let me do another poem, which is one of my favorites, because it applies also how we think so often about things. This is a more recent one called Today. Today came, smiling towards me, arms laden with brightly wrapped gifts. And I said, I'll be with you in a minute. You see, I was in this conversation with yesterday. I forgot exactly what it was all about. And it went on. And I called out to today, I'll be right with you. Then, when yesterday finally finished with me, and before I could get back to today, tomorrow barged right up and began talking. I called out to today, just give me a few more minutes. Well, tomorrow I would be satisfied with nothing less than dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's. I forgot what it was about exactly. You know how tomorrow can be. So I called out to today, just hang in there. Tomorrow, satisfied at last, left me. And I looked up, and today was gone. That's from Leo Rock, Making Friends with Yourself. It's just a reminder, how can they be just in the present and think how much of our time we're anticipating all the disasters in the future, or rehearsing all the failures of our past. When we say, I should not have done that, that would be practice 10. And I can change that. It is possible to change the thought. As the experience I started with of the story, it's not easy. It's remarkably challenging. It's so easy to change. Let me shift for a moment. I share the screen. I love this slide, a Peanuts cartoon, because basically I want to argue that there are many factors that affect depression or anxiety, and language is only one component. For some, it's the most important. For others, it's a smaller one. But overall, the underlying theme, what I said about cognitive behavior therapy, is that there is a connection between thoughts and emotion. And I love this old Peanuts cartoon, which says, this is my depressed stance. And when you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand. The worst thing you can do is to straighten up and hold your head high because you start to feel better. And if you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you have to stand like this. And I think it is really critical to recognize that posture truly and how our bodies are connect. And for those who were participating in the Upright Go-To study, or not, who've signed up for the equipment, this will be a great piece to do. And so finally going back to depression, I'm not going to talk more. I want to just do a exercise with all of you. So I'd like you all to stand. Just stand. And as you're standing, I'd like you to evoke a time that you felt hopeless, helpless, powerless. No, think of a time when you felt really defeated, in a sense, very difficult. And take on that body posture. Really make it as real as possible. Really evoke that memory again. Make it as real. Really feel it. You may need a little more time. You could pause the recording. But if you feel it and your body is in that position, now shift. And now think of a very positive memory, a joyous one, and configure your body in this joyous position. Really configure it. Be there. Configure it. Feel that joyful memory. Make it as real as possible. Really make it as real. Feel it. Good. Now go back and configure your body again, being totally defeated and depressed. Put your body in that position. Hold it there. And now evoke, while holding this body position, evoke that optimistic, positive memory. Don't change the body, just evoke it. I think that's good enough. Now shift, put yourself in this happy, optimistic, empowered body position. And while in this empowered body position, evoke that kind of negative, hopeless, defeated memory. Okay, good enough. You can sit. And what did you observe? If you're like almost everyone who has done this exercise, what you observed was that when you combined posture with the emotion and thought, you felt the emotion much stronger. When they were out of sync, being in a collapsed position evoking a positive memory, either it was harder to evoke the memory or your body almost wanted to change. And the same way when I was in an empowered position, it was harder to really get captured or be evoked by the negative powerless memory. I think what we all forget is that our brain, our bodies, and minds, emotions are connected. And it really comes from an evolutionary perspective. That, you know, we could ask the question, I'm doing a detour, why do we have brains? Why do we have a nervous system? And it's so interesting to think about that. Maybe I should show you that slide for a moment, which I'll do. Why do we have a nervous system? Why did evolution develop a nervous system? I think that's it's a very interesting question from an evolutionary perspective. And it looks like that from all the research people can think about, the reason we initially, as a multi-organism, millions and millions of years ago, developed a nervous system is to do coordination of movement. So movement is intrinsic to our brain. And it's so interesting that there's an animal called the sea squirt that as an animal, swims in the ocean as a juvenile. It has a nervous system. And then it implants itself on a rock. And then it almost acts like a plant. And since it never needs to do coordination again, it digests its own brain and nervous system. Oops. That's hard to believe, but and I think that happens for us too. So the data for this is to say movement is intrinsic for health. And when one is depressed, in this case, DNL, we tend to move much less. And there's very good research to suggest that when you do controlled studies between antidepressants and exercise, that after 3 months, the outcomes are identical. Whether you take the antidepressant or do exercise, the outcome is the same. However, if you now withdraw all treatment and now follow the people out for a year, you see a massive significant benefit of the exercise. Fewer people regress. Fewer people become depressed than the ones who took the medication. So it's really a suggestive that exercise and movement is a very powerful strategy. It's a behavioral strategy. And again, it's not easy. Here again, it's so useful to have support around you to take you for exercise when you don't feel having that energy, having that social support. And I'll end, I think, with all this, with one study to remind me, which I also shared in class already, of thoughts. I would argue from the data that by combining body and reframing works easier than just trying to reframe your thoughts. So what I mean by that is, if you, and I can ask you to do that for a moment, all you do is just sit, think of a stressful conflict or a negative thought, make it as real as possible for a moment. Just keep thinking that. And then you do this for 1 minute, and then after a minute, just let it go. Let it go. Or try to reframe it. Don't do anything, just reframe it positively. Try to work at reframing it positively. Okay, that's one strategy. That's a classical kind of cognitive behavior strategy. I evoke the memory in a certain way, or I can be aware of it. Then I just make an attempt to change it. It works out is much less effective than when you combine this with breathing and posture. So if you do the same exercise, evoke that negative, that kind of conflict, that problem, and now you shift your body position and look upwards and breathe and then reframe, it's much easier to do that. And if I can show you that data, I'm always impressed when our students have done that. When we follow them up. And you can just see, when you combine your posture change, body movement change with breath and changing your internal language, you're much more effective reducing your thoughts and anxiety and tension compared to just doing the language. You know, it is remarkable. So if I look at another way here, we can say it differently. Here's where people combine posture, breath, and language. This is their rating on the left of negative thoughts and negative anxiety and tension. This is how successful they were in reducing it. They're much more successful than if you just only attempt to change your thoughts. So I think the lesson to learn here is that when we do cognitive therapy, when we want to change our words, change your body, it will give you a different perspective to do this. And that is a piece that is so often missing in our world. Now the final piece. And this comes from the work of Alzheimer's. So it's a totally shift. It's one of the fun studies I came across. It's a long-term study of nuns. It's the work by Snowden, published in 2002. He had the opportunity to study nuns who the average age was 75 to 102 from the School of Sisters of Notre Dame. These are all women by definition. They all are probably Northern European. So they had no children. They had very little alcohol. They had very similar occupations. They had good access to medical care. They lived in a community as a group. And what was unique about this study, as these nuns were getting older and older, some developed Alzheimer's. He had the opportunity to study them on a longitudinal study for the last part of their lives. So these nuns would fill out cognitive assessment questionnaires. And then what makes the study unique is after they died, he had persuaded them to allow an autopsy on the brain. So they could now actually look whether there were plaques in the brain or not. So when you have Alzheimer's, you may see these excessive plaques. And then he found some most interesting phenomena. That the nuns who had a positive perspective in their world, as I talked about earlier, who interpret the world more positively, who were optimistic, were the ones who, if they did get Alzheimer's, I want to underline this, as measured by the neurological test, or when they had cognitive failure, when the autopsy was done after they had died, their brain was much more severely affected compared to how they tested. While on the other hand, the nuns as a group who were pessimistic in their perspective, who reinterpreted the world more negatively in that way, when they got the initial loss, they would interpret this, they would be much more affected, and in fact, their brain may have shown less damage. So it looks like that just your own perspective has changed your brain in a way, and you can cope better with the Alzheimer's. It's most interesting. And the final piece of that work of these nuns, which is also most interesting, and it may be useful for all of us to think about, that he had one more finding. All the nuns, well, there were 180 nuns they studied of this group, who had written in the 1930s an autobiography, which was required when they entered the convent. They had to write it for a 300-word autobiography. And then Snowden asked the question, I wonder if the autobiography, which you write it, you're about 20 or so, before you enter nunnery or the convent, if that could be related to the onset of Alzheimer's many more years later in old age. And it's most interesting, the answer looks like yes. And what they observed was when they looked at these autobiographies, the nuns who wrote their autobiographies with very few ideas expressed in the autobiography, they had low idea density. They were not wrong, they were not stupid, they had great IQ. But the ones who wrote the essay, these autobiographical essays with very low idea density, were the ones who essentially 6 decades later were the ones who ended up getting Alzheimer's. The ones who had high idea density were the ones who 6 decades later did not develop Alzheimer's. And also tentative longer, 10 years longer than the ones who express most negative, who express fewest positive emotions. So if you express a lot of positive emotions, you live 10 years longer on the average than if you expressed very few positive emotions in this essay, as well as the content that idea density was related to Alzheimer's. Let me give an example of some of these quotes. And then, so here's a low idea density. I was born in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, May 24th, 1913, and I was baptized in St. James Church. That's one sister who died soon, had severe Alzheimer's early on. Here's the other sister. It was a half an hour before midnight, between February 28th and 29th of the leap year 1912, and I began to live and die as the third child of my mother, whose maiden name was Hilda Hoffman and my father Otto Schmidt. You know, the nuns achieved similar things in life, but somehow how they may interpret the world, frame it in their brain, seemed to have affected their health and longevity and even the possibility of Alzheimer's. I often think of it structurally to say, if I just limit if I have very low idea density, I just say, this is it. And you can sometimes see if some of your friends, you ask them, how do you feel? Fine. And others can really elaborate, make many other connections. I'm exaggerating, but especially if you reflect to yourself, I wonder if by creating few ideas, you're creating fewer and fewer dendritic connections to other cells. So then when you do get Alzheimer's or the plaque formation, there's less resilience in the brain. It breaks down earlier. But if I had many, many connections, a lot of damage can occur and I can still survive. Anyway, it's food for thought. Ask yourself, how do you interpret the world? Ideally, your home practice would be write a 300 or 500 word essay, maybe 300 words. Include the place of birth, your parentage, interest, and idea and events of one's childhood. Just write it and then look at it later and see how much idea density is in your paragraph. And if it's low, maybe you want to say, hey, I can change. The ideal experiment would be to look at the people that have both high and low idea density today as students, and now take half the groups who have low idea density as you look at your own form, train you to increase your idea density, purposely train your brain to do it, just like you can learn a foreign language or other things. And I wonder if that would be a factor in our future health and brain health. So I think I would say, I realize that's speculative, and you could ask the questions about Alzheimer's. Is it genetic? What about neuroplasticity? But at least it's food for thought. And on that note, enjoy.